No one saw the trucks coming. In the early morning light, they lurched past the front gate of Silver Palms Estates, a quiet community once known for its dogwood-lined sidewalks and tidy stoops. The HOA board typically boasted about being transparent in all matters, but here they were, a grim convoy of plain, white vehicles carrying large tanks, spraying something into the thick, still air. A few residents peered nervously from behind drawn curtains, confusion sparking in their eyes. Had the HOA given notice about some new maintenance project? Most folks assumed it was insecticide for seasonal pests, the sort of thing that was usually announced weeks in advance. Today, though, there'd been no flyers, no posted sign at the clubhouse, no email blasts. There was only a creeping sense of dread that drifted on the pungent odor rolling through the neighborhood. Helen Barnes, a widow of 68, noticed the smell first. The stench reminded her of ammonia and scorched leaves, a chemical reek that tickled the back of her throat. For nearly 3 decades, she'd been the unofficial eyes and ears of her cul-de-sac. Her neighbors, especially the newer ones, had come to rely on her gentle manner and institutional knowledge. She knitted hats for newborns and nursed ailing cats back to health. No one knew more about the area's rhythms and small-town gossip than Helen. Standing at her kitchen window, she rubbed her watering eyes and watched the trucks roll past. The uniformed men operating the spraying arms wore masks, but they didn't wave to her. They simply kept spraying. Down the street, Greg Huffman, a retired firefighter who prided himself on vigilance, was out walking his golden retriever, Rosie. He'd given up smoking years ago, but the scratch at the back of his lungs felt uncannily like the first drag of a cheap cigarette. When Rosie started coughing, an icy sliver of concern stabbed at Greg's chest. He knew the difference between a typical cough and the strangled, choking hack that signaled danger. Alarmed, he tugged Rosie back inside and checked his phone for HOA emails. Nothing new, just the usual monthly bulletin praising the water-saving landscaping changes and reminding folks to keep their hedges trimmed. Confusion turned to apprehension. By midday, the chemical haze had settled heavily over manicured lawns and trimmed rose bushes, seeping into every open window. The dining hall of the community center, usually bustling with seniors playing bridge, was conspicuously empty. A handful of residents wandered around, eyes streaming, throats raw. Some wore makeshift masks or scarves. Others were too woozy to do more than cling to door frames, pressing damp cloths to their mouths. Local news station Channel 7 caught wind of the situation and dispatched a single reporter, but within minutes, he was gasping for air and retreating to the safety of his van. Panic began to spread like an uncontrolled fire. Text messages flew between neighbors. "What's going on? Are you okay? Should we evacuate?" The HOA board members remained conspicuously silent. Phone calls routed to a voicemail system. Several worried residents reached out to city officials, but the municipal offices were swamped with calls and offered only vague assurances that they'd look into it. Amid the confusion, the men with the spraying trucks remained unreachable. Like grim phantoms, they completed their rounds and then disappeared, leaving only a noxious cloud behind. Inside her one-story bungalow, Helen tried to check in on her friend Marie, who had a compromised immune system and lived alone. When the phone rang endlessly, Helen decided to brave the chemical-laden air. She wrapped a damp scarf around her face and ventured down the block. The typically sun-soaked sidewalk felt like a corridor of stale poison. Helen's eyes burned until they were raw. She nearly tripped on a sagging bag of groceries Marie had left by her own door, as if she'd been too sick to bring them inside. Heart-pounding, Helen knocked repeatedly. Finally, Marie opened the door, her face pallid and sweaty, coughs erupting in short, sharp bursts. The smell of chemicals inside was even more intense. Marie's windows still gaped open from the mild winter day. Toxins had presumably flowed straight in. "Call someone," Marie gasped before another coughing fit stole her breath. Helen, horrified, tried to help Marie to her couch, but the older woman's legs wobbled and gave way. Helen helped her onto the cushions, then fumbled for her phone to call 911. The line was busy. Desperate, she dialed Greg's number. He picked up immediately, his voice gravelly from irritation in his throat. Without preamble, Helen begged him to come help. Within minutes, Greg arrived. Rosie waited safely in his living room, away from the toxic cloud. Together, Greg and Helen managed to drag Marie into Greg's truck, the windows sealed tight, the air conditioning recirculating. They sped toward the local hospital, ignoring the posted speed limits and the startled honks from passing cars. As they left, none of them noticed that at the end of the road, a brand new sign had been erected by unknown hands. It bore the HOA logo and proclaimed, in bold red letters, "Spraying in progress. Do not enter without protective gear." But for most of Silver Palms Estates, it was already too late. The emergency room at St. Hubert's had never seen so many seniors filing in all at once. Wheelchairs lined the corridors. Harried nurses dashed from room to room, stepping over extension cords and weaving around gurneys. Greg's heart pounded as he supported Marie's trembling frame, her shallow breathing rasping in his ears. Once a busy volunteer and crocheter of baby blankets for the hospital's charity drives, she now looked hollow-cheeked and fearful. Helen trailed behind them, her chest tight, wishing she had come sooner. A swarm of worried, exhausted residents from Silver Palms Estates had converged on the hospital. Some clutched oxygen masks provided by paramedics, while others simply tried to find a place to sit. Greg waved down a nurse, explaining that Marie had inhaled some unknown chemical. The nurse's face tightened. "We've got half your neighborhood in triage," she said. "We've called the Poison Control Center. They're investigating. Until we know more, we're administering oxygen and monitoring vital signs." Marie was whisked away to a curtained cubicle. Helen and Greg waited, straining to catch murmurs from staff. Through the partially drawn curtain, Helen glimpsed a few specialists hooking Marie to 4 drips and placing a breathing apparatus over her nose. It reminded Helen painfully of her late husband's hospital stays before he passed. She found herself trembling, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them away. There was no time to succumb to fear. People needed help, and knowledge was power. She decided to find out what on earth the HOA had done. Helen dialed the HOA's main office number again. The line rang and rang before going to the same automated voicemail. Next, she tried calling the board president directly, Martin Rhodes, a man in his 40s who had moved to Silver Palms a few years prior. He'd run for the presidency on a platform of safer streets and better property values. Maybe he'd have some answers. No luck. The phone rang unanswered. A part of Helen wanted to march right over to Martin's house and demand an explanation, but she had no idea if the chemical fog had fully cleared or if Martin was even at home. Meanwhile, Greg called the local fire station to speak with old acquaintances, hoping someone might shed light on the situation. He was disheartened to learn that the station had no record of an authorized chemical spray for Silver Palms Estates. "We're hearing chatter about it on the radio," said a hoarse voice on the other end. "And the city's environmental unit is heading there, but we haven't received official request for hazmat support. We'll do what we can." By late afternoon, test results began trickling in. Patients from Silver Palms were suffering from respiratory distress, eye irritation, and, in a few severe cases, neurological symptoms like tremors. The hospital staff confirmed elevated levels of pesticides in their blood and recommended immediate decontamination for anyone who'd been exposed. But decontamination for an entire community was a logistical nightmare. The ER was stretched thin. Helen learned from a nurse that 2 patients, an elderly couple named Rita and James Foster, were in critical condition. She remembered them as sweet folks who adored feeding hummingbirds in their yard. Before moving to Silver Palms, they'd spent decades traveling in an RV, only to settle down where they believed they'd be surrounded by peace and security. Now Rita was on a ventilator, her fragile lungs pummeled by toxins. The heartbreak in the hospital's corridors felt crushing. In the midst of the chaos, Helen's cell phone rang. Startled, she lifted it to her ear, half expecting it to be Martin or some other HOA official. Instead, the caller ID read unknown. She considered letting it go to voicemail, but decided to answer. A shaky female voice whispered, "Helen, it's Rebecca Adams from the HOA board. I'm sorry for calling like this." Rebecca paused to suppress a sob. "I can't talk long. I didn't know what we were spraying. I thought it was a new, stronger pesticide for the common areas. Nobody told me it would be toxic to humans. We had a hush-hush contract with a pest control company for invasive weevils. They said they'd do it early in the morning, but they never told us about any risk to residents." Helen's pulse hammered. "Rebecca, what do you mean they never told you about a risk?" But Rebecca was already rushing on, as though reading from script. "It was all Martin's doing. He brokered the deal. I overheard him saying it would save us thousands of dollars. Thousands. This was about money. Please understand, I only found out the name of the chemical an hour ago. It's illegal in several states." The line clicked, cutting Rebecca off mid-sentence. Helen stared at her phone, simultaneously furious and horrified. The HOA had knowingly used a banned chemical to save money? Or at least Martin had, based on what Rebecca was saying. Had no one considered the safety of the community? As if answering her question, an overhead announcement in the ER declared a code red. Nurses and doctors scurried around with new urgency. Helen's stomach knotted. She braced herself against the wall, trying to quell the rising terror that perhaps this was only the beginning. With a deep inhale that made her own throat burn, Helen vowed she wouldn't allow this to be swept under the rug. She'd learned long ago, from losing a husband, from seeing tragedy overshadow good sense, that the only way to fight wrongdoing was to expose it. And if Martin Rhodes and the HOA had done something unscrupulous, she intended to make the truth known, even if it meant putting herself in the crosshairs. After the hospital staff stabilized Marie, Helen insisted on returning to Silver Palms Estates. Greg, weary and worried, offered to drive her. "Helen, we can't just march in," he said as they pulled out of the hospital parking lot. Who knows what fumes are still hanging around? But Helen was resolute. "I have to see if there are others who need help," she replied. Her voice shook, though she tried to sound strong. In her mind, she pictured the sweet retirees who trusted their HOA to maintain a comfortable lifestyle. They'd paid monthly dues for what? A toxic cloud to invade their homes? The closer they got to Silver Palms, the more deserted the streets looked. Trash cans still stood at the curb, lids askew. Lawns that had been meticulously trimmed now seemed eerily vacant. The hush that fell over the community was unnerving. On the corners, they spotted a few newly planted signs from the HOA, all reading the same message. Warning, restricted access, chemical spraying in progress. The disclaimers were too little, too late, posted hours after the fact. They approached Martin Rhodes's house, a modern two-story with a solar-paneled roof. No lights were on, no car in the driveway. Greg rapped on the front door, the sound echoing in the silence. No answer. Helen's jaw tightened. It felt as though Martin was in hiding. The memory of Rebecca's frantic call crackled in Helen's mind. It was all Martin's doing something about money. "Let's check the HOA office," Helen suggested. The official HOA building was a refurbished bungalow near the community entrance. Inside was a small reception desk, a board meeting room, and a labyrinth of file cabinets with everything from landscaping blueprints to community bylaws. It was typically staffed during weekdays, but at this hour the glass doors were locked. Helen rattled the handle. "Well, guess we're not getting in," Greg said with a resigned shrug. Helen glanced around, a frown of determination forming on her face. Then she noticed the side window, slightly ajar, likely an oversight by someone who left in a hurry. She had no illusions about the legality of sneaking in, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Exchanging a look with Greg, she slid the window open wider and hoisted herself through. Greg followed suit, landing clumsily on a dusty file box. Inside, the lights were off, but the faint glow from security panels illuminated the corridor. The place looked hurriedly abandoned. Papers scattered, half-empty styrofoam coffee cups left on desks. Helen made her way to the board meeting room. She'd attended countless gatherings here, arguments about fence heights, discussions over water usage. Now it felt like a stage set for a crime. On a corkboard by the door hung a newly pinned document titled Pest Control Initiative, Contract and Agreement. Helen's breath caught. This must be the contract that Rebecca mentioned. She carefully removed the paper from the board. Under a faint exit sign, they read the typed words. The contract was with a company called Emerald Shield Pest Management. The document listed various chemicals, including one scrawled in red pen, kilotrizine D. Helen recognized the name from a consumer alert she'd seen years ago. She remembered that it was potentially lethal if misused, banned for residential spraying in many states. The contract's final page bore the signature of Martin Rhodes, dated just a week ago. Helen's voice quivered with rage. He knew, she hissed. He signed off on this. And look at this part here. Restricted usage regulations may apply, subject to local municipality codes. The HOA assumes all liability. All liability. This entire time, Martin was protecting no one but the HOA's budget. Greg exhaled a slow, furious breath. That's enough to land them in serious trouble. If the chemical is banned or restricted, they should have secured special permits and, more importantly, alerted the residents. Instead, they did it in secret. He ran a hand through his hair. Helen, we need to get this to the authorities. Before Helen could respond, a sudden beam of light flooded the hallway. Footsteps, heavy and sure, pounded against the tiled floor. Greg stuffed the contract into his jacket pocket, and they both scrambled to hide behind a door. Two figures emerged, a middle-aged man in a polo shirt and a woman in slacks, each wearing official-looking lanyards. Their conversation echoed through the empty corridor. This entire operation is a disaster, the man muttered, rubbing his forehead. We told them to inform residents. They insisted they had it under control. The woman shook her head. We never should have agreed to the morning schedule. The risk of exposure was too high. Helen's heart thundered. These had to be representatives from Emerald Shield. She wondered if they knew someone had died. She swallowed hard, recalling what she'd overheard in the hospital. One patient was in dire shape, and another not responding to treatment. Then, footsteps paused near the board meeting room. The man asked, You sure you locked up here? We can't have people snooping around. The woman nodded. Yeah, I locked it. Let's just grab the contract copies and go. We need to get rid of any incriminating documents. Helen's skin prickled with alarm. She made a silent gesture to Greg, who quietly clenched the contract in his pocket. If these two destroyed the evidence, the residents would have no proof of wrongdoing, no path to justice for those who were hospitalized or worse. Minutes stretched painfully, each second a risk that they'd be discovered. Eventually, the two gave up searching the board meeting room, apparently satisfied it was empty. Their footsteps receded down the hall. Helen listened until the sound died away. Then, she took a trembling breath, turned, and whispered, We have to go. Now. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting elongated shadows over the vacant cul-de-sac. Helen and Greg hurried back to his pickup truck, the stolen contract pressed securely to Helen's chest. Her heart beat so loudly in her ears that she felt almost disoriented, and for a moment she could scarcely believe all that had happened since sunrise. It felt like a nightmare come to life. They drove to the local police station, located in a strip mall next to a pharmacy and a shuttered diner. The building was modest, only a front desk, a few offices, and a holding cell or two. Inside, a young officer named Alvarez listened politely as Helen recounted the day's events. The unannounced spraying, the hospitalizations, the contract they discovered. Alvarez's expression turned grim. Let me get my supervisor, he said. This is above my pay grade. Minutes later, Lieutenant Briggs appeared, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s whose silver mustache bristled when he was agitated. He listened carefully, thumbs tucked into his belt. Then Helen placed the contract on the table. As his eyes scanned the text, his brow furrowed. I've heard rumors about chemical misuse in some HOAs, Briggs admitted, but I've never seen something this blatant. If the chemical is restricted or banned, they should have followed strict protocol. Permits, protective measures, advance warning to residents, everything. Instead, it sounds like they tried to cut corners. Greg nodded. My friend at the fire station told me nobody requested any official supervision. Is there enough here for you to press charges or open a formal investigation? Lieutenant Briggs let out a deep sigh. It's complicated. We're going to interview the HOA members, gather statements, talk to the pest control company. But yes, based on this contract and the hospitalization reports, we'll be launching a formal inquiry. He pointed to the last page, to Martin Rhodes's signature. This man could be facing criminal negligence charges, or worse, if someone died as a result of this. Helen pressed her lips together, her thoughts going to the sweet couple, the Fosters, and the possibility that others might be in the ICU. Someone has died, she said quietly, her voice trembling. Or at least, that's what I heard from a nurse. They couldn't save one of the residents. I don't know who it was. Possibly James or Rita Foster. They were both critical. A moment of thick silence. Greg closed his eyes as if trying to pray away the tragedy. Briggs swallowed, anger burning in his eyes. All right, he said, gathering his composure. We need official statements from you both. After that, you can expect a detective will want to follow up. Helen and Greg spent the next hour detailing their accounts, from the moment they smelled the chemical in the air to their infiltration of the HOA office. While they spoke, Alvarez made copies of the contract. Helen also shared the cryptic call from Rebecca Adams. Briggs wrote everything down carefully. We'll try to locate Ms. Adams for questioning, too. If what she says is true, the HOA president was well aware of the dangers. By the time they left the station, night had fallen. Street lamps cast puddles of light on the asphalt, and insects hummed in the warm evening air. Helen felt a jumbled mix of relief and dread. Relief because they had passed the evidence along to the proper authorities. Dread because she knew these kinds of fights often took time. During that time, more people could suffer, and the truth could still get buried by well-funded legal teams. Greg offered to drive Helen to the hospital again to check on Marie. She agreed, though anxiety gnawed at her stomach. As they pulled into the hospital lot, they noticed a local news van. A small crowd of reporters milled around, microphones in hand, cameras ready. Looks like word is spreading, Greg said. Inside, the hospital was less frantic but still busy with families pacing hallways, holding cups of cold coffee. Helen found Marie's room number and knocked softly. A muffled voice told her to come in. She opened the door to find Marie propped up on pillows, an oxygen cannula looped around her ears. She looked exhausted but managed a faint smile. Helen, you're a sight for sore eyes. Helen approached the bed, gently taking Marie's hand. How are you feeling? Marie shrugged weakly. Better than earlier. The doctors say the toxins are still in my system, but at least my breathing's improved. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes flicking to Greg. Thank you for bringing me here. Greg nodded. Wouldn't have left you behind. He hesitated, then asked about the Fosters. Marie's expression dimmed. Rita made it. She's recovering, too. But James, she trailed off, lips quivering. He passed a few hours ago. Heart failure and respiratory collapse. Helen closed her eyes, a wave of sorrow crashing over her. James had been such a kind man, always chatting about jazz clubs he once visited in Chicago. She swore she could still hear his jovial laugh echoing in her memory. It wasn't supposed to end like this, not for him, not for anyone. Sensing Helen's distress, Marie squeezed her hand. You're not to blame, she whispered. If anything, you may have saved me and some others from the same fate. Yet Helen couldn't escape the sting of guilt. She wished she'd paid attention sooner, demanded answers faster. I promise I'll do everything in my power to see that justice is served, she said quietly. No more of this hush-hush deal. No more reckless endangerment. Marie nodded weakly, her eyelids fluttering with fatigue. Just be careful, she murmured. Whoever orchestrated this, they probably won't like being exposed. Helen nodded, a new determination settling into her bones. She wouldn't stop until she found a way to bring Martin Rhodes and anyone else responsible to account for James's death. Silver Palms Estates might have lost one of its residents tonight, but it wouldn't lose its conscience. Not if she had anything to say about it. 2 weeks later, Silver Palms Estates remained under a somber cloud. Not of chemicals, but of collective grief and simmering anger. Local headlines blared. Illegal pesticide spraying kills elderly resident in quiet HOA community. The tragedy caught the attention of state regulators and environmental watchdogs. Investigators swarmed the site, taking soil and air samples, interviewing residents, combing through HOA files. The hush around the entire affair had been shattered. In the interim, Martin Rhodes had vanished from Silver Palms. Rumors circulated he'd fled to a cousin's house in a neighboring county. A local news station ran a brief clip of him being confronted outside a post office, hurrying to his car with a jacket shielding his face. With each passing day, outrage grew. Neighbors demanded answers, families threatened lawsuits, and retirees who could afford to moved away, unwilling to spend their golden years looking over their shoulders for the next tragedy. Helen became a sort of spokesperson for the concerned residents. Despite her initial reluctance, she'd never courted public attention. She found herself fielding calls from journalists, lawyers, and government inspectors. The impetus was James Foster's needless death, but it also came from a deeper sense of betrayal. Silver Palms had been her home for decades, and she wouldn't allow it to be stained by the actions of a few unscrupulous people. One afternoon, Helen stood in front of the community clubhouse. A modest crowd gathered on the lawn. Cameras clicked. Microphones hovered. She cleared her throat, feeling a flutter of nerves. Greg stood by her side, Marie watching from her wheelchair near the front row. "My name is Helen Barnes," she began, voice echoing through the portable PA system. "I've lived in Silver Palms Estates for 30 years. We've seen storms, hurricanes, floods, and fires. But we have never faced something like this. And we have never buried one of our own because of the direct negligence of our HOA president." A hush fell over the onlookers. Some dabbed tears from their eyes. Others clenched their fists. Helen lifted her chin. "Let me be clear. We are not powerless. Our community is strong, united by decades of friendship and shared experiences. When one of us is harmed, we all hurt. We will not stand for secret contracts or reckless cost-cutting that endangers lives. We demand accountability, we demand transparency, and we demand justice for James Foster and for all those who have been harmed." A reporter fired a question. "Helen, do you plan to file a class action lawsuit against the HOA and Emerald Shield Pest Management?" Helen inhaled. "We are exploring every legal avenue. Several attorneys have reached out. And yes, a class action suit is likely. We want answers. We want regulations enforced. And we want to ensure no other community suffers this kind of betrayal." In the days that followed, depositions were taken. Rebecca Adams, after much urging, gave a sworn statement. She revealed that Martin Rhodes had insisted on the hush-hush approach to secure a sizable discount from Emerald Shield. They'd exploited a loophole in the local pesticide regulations, forging ahead without city oversight. Emerald Shield's employees, for their part, claimed they'd instructed Martin to inform residents, but they never followed up to ensure it was done. A chain of negligence. A chorus of greed. A single, tragic outcome. Eventually, Martin Rhodes was found and served with an arrest warrant. As he was led away in handcuffs, cameras captured his gaunt, frightened face. Gone was the polished smile he'd flashed at HOA meetings when championing fiscal responsibility. He now appeared as a man haunted by his own actions. The district attorney announced charges of involuntary manslaughter, criminal negligence, and multiple violations of environmental law. Emerald Shield also faced heavy fines and possible shutdown. Though a sense of triumph rippled through Silver Palms, it was tempered by the loss that had already taken place. James Foster's funeral was held in a white-painted church on the outskirts of town. More than half the community attended, along with curious outsiders who had followed the story in the news. Rita, fragile but determined, insisted on saying a few words about her husband. She spoke of his love for music, his devotion to neighbors, his childlike wonder at hummingbirds. Tears streamed from nearly every face in the sanctuary. Helen found herself sitting next to Greg, her hand clasped in his. She caught sight of Marie a few pews away, quietly sobbing. That evening, after the funeral, a group of residents gathered in Helen's living room. Greg, Marie and a half-dozen others sipped tea and nibbled on pastries. The conversation turned to rebuilding trust and ensuring the next HOA president, whoever that would prioritize safety and integrity. Ideas abounded. Mandatory transparency logs, open community forums, rotating leadership so no one person had total authority. Helen listened, a slow warmth filling her chest. As heartbroken as they all were, there was a resolute strength in these people. The old adage about adversity, forging unity, never rang more true. They would learn from this tragedy and emerge a more vigilant, caring community. And perhaps that was the best way to honor the memory of those who suffered. At the end of the night, Marie, still weak, asked Helen for a private word. In a soft voice, she said, "I've been thinking. If not for you, I might not be alive. Thank you. And I'm sorry about James. Maybe we couldn't save him, but you saved me." She wiped a tear. "That counts for something." Helen embraced her gently. "We just have to make sure it never happens again," she said. "That's how we make his loss count, by protecting everyone else." A hush fell between them, carrying both grief and an unspoken promise. They would remember James, they would heal, and they would do better. Together. The end.